Okay, so now we're going to be looking at complex number operations. So we talked about a complex number the other day. It's a real part and an imaginary part. So the standard form is a plus bi, where I is your imaginary part and a is your real part. So it says, when simplifying expressions containing imaginary parts, distribute and combine your like terms. That's supposed to be like terms. So your like terms are very similar with your, just like variables. You're going to combine the real parts, and then you're going to combine the imaginary parts. Any i's with exponents greater than 1, you need to further simplify. Remember that I squared equals a negative 1, so make sure you're replacing your I squareds with negative 1. All right, so example 1, we're going to simplify, write the answer in standard form, which we already went over. It's a plus bi. So notice I have parentheses. You do it the same way as that if that I was just like a variable. So I'm going to distribute. That's negative 12i. And then multiplying those, you're multiplying outsides together. So that's negative 3i times a negative I is a positive 3i squared. So we add the exponents when we multiply. And then square root of 2. Okay, so now we're going to look at it. We have this negative 12i. And then remember, I squared equals a negative 1. So 3 times a negative 1 would give me a negative 3. And then the square root of 2. And then we want to put it in standard form. So we want to put the real part first. So negative 3 square root of 2. And then your negative 12i. All right, so now let's take a look at the next one. So part B. Notice that we are adding these together. So you add, it's just like adding like terms. So we're going to combine the real parts. 7 plus 4 is 11. And then you're going to combine the imaginary parts. So 1i minus 2i is a negative I. And that is already in standard form. So there's my answer. Okay, so part C. We're going to be subtracting this one, but make sure you go ahead and distribute your subtraction sign, and so that becomes plus I there. I'm just going to rewrite the first part, just bringing it down. The parentheses is really not necessary there. So I'm going to combine my real parts. Notice that just gives me a 0, and then combining your imaginary parts, that would be a negative 4i. Remember, when you add or subtract, you never change your exponents. So that's just negative 4i. All right, looking at part D, we're going to distribute. So that's multiplying your 2 and 8, 16i square root of 5. And then multiplying these, we multiply the 2 and the 9, which is 18. And then the I times the I is I squared. Because remember, when you multiply, you add the exponents. And then we also have that square root of 5 there. Okay, so remember the I squared equals a negative 1. Very important. You need to replace it. So it's going to change that 18 to negative. And then just rewriting the rest of it. All right, so remember we write the real part first. So negative 18 square root of 5 is the real part because there's no I in it. And then we have a positive, so 16i square root of 5. So your real part always comes first, and then your imaginary part. All right, looking at the next one, notice we're adding, but we have to distribute before we can add. So I'm going to distribute 24 plus 4i, bring down your plus sign. You get 2, and then plus 2i. So now we're just adding them up like terms. So I'm combining the 24 and 2, which would be 26. And then the imaginary parts, we get 6i. Remember, you do not change your exponents when you're adding and subtracting. All right, part F, we're subtracting. We need to distribute that before we can start combining your like terms. So that's going to be negative 27 and then minus 9i. So my real part, notice there's nothing else to combine with it, so I write it first. And then combining the imaginary parts, you get negative 2i. All right, moving on. Notice this next one, we are multiplying them because there's no operation in between the two sets of parentheses. Anytime I have a binomial times a binomial, I need to multiply by using FOIL. So I'm multiplying the first terms, which would be 30. multiply the outside terms, which would be 42i. Multiply your inside terms, make sure you look at that negative sign, that's negative 50i. And then multiplying your last terms, negative 10i times 7i is negative 70i squared. All right, so then I'm going to replace my I squared with negative 1. So if I do that, that's going to change that to a plus 70. I'll just bring down everything else. And then I'm going to combine my real parts and imaginary parts. So 30 plus 70 is 100. And then combining your imaginary parts, you get negative 8i. So make sure you're using the same rules as if the I was a variable. So have to use FOIL when you multiply binomials. All right, H, we're squaring. So remember when we square, we multiply it by itself. So I want you to write it out. And we're going to use FOIL again because this is a binomial times a binomial. 8 times 8, 64. 8 times 3i is 24i. Same thing, 24i. And then 3i times 3i is 9i squared. Okay, so remember, anytime you have an I squared in your answer, you need to replace it with negative 1. So 9 times a negative 1 would give me a negative 9 there. So now I'm going to combine my real parts. So that would be 55. And then combining your imaginary parts in the middle, that would be 48i. So don't forget, when you square a binomial, that you must use FOIL. So make sure that you're doing that. All right, last one. So notice we're subtracting, so I need to distribute that. So that's a negative I cubed minus I to the 4th. And then I have I plus I squared. Okay, so remember I squared is a negative 1. And then I cubed, so we actually did this on the last lesson. I cubed is the same thing as I squared times I. All right, so we know I squared is negative 1. We times it by I, and we get negative I. So you need to know that I cubed is negative I. So I'm going to plug that in. So I'm bringing down my subtraction sign. I cubed is negative I. And then we need to see I to the 4th. Remember, I to the 4th is the same thing as I squared times I squared. And we already know I squared is negative 1. So I to the 4th is positive 1. So we bring your subtraction sign down. We know that's positive 1 for I to the 4th. Now we're going to start combining them. So I have I minus 1. That becomes a plus I. And then that becomes a minus 1. So combining your real parts, you get negative 2. And then combining your i's, 1i plus 1i is 2i. So a couple of key things that you need to jot down. We already know I squared is negative 1, so make sure you have that somewhere on your notes. Now we know, and we already did it on the last lesson, I cubed is negative I, and I to the 4th equals positive 1. So those are the things that you need to know, because remember at the top we said we have to simplify it further if the exponent of your I is something greater than 1. Let me know if you have any questions.